This Explain Everything is looking at the control of breathing. Let's look at the muscles of inhalation, those involved in ventilation, and just appreciate that in inhalation you must increase the volume of the thoracic cavity and therefore the lungs, decreasing pressure so that air is going to move from the atmosphere into the lungs and thus inhalation. Okay, there's two sets of muscles that we're going to look at here. There's the external intercostals and the diaphragm. These are going to be involved with normal, quiet breathing. And then we have the other set here, the sternocleidomastoid and the scalenes, and also the pectoralis major. And it's going to be involved in forced breathing or labored breathing. In both cases, let's just take a look at what's going on. Okay, the diaphragm right here is going to be moving down, and the ribs are going to be elevated, and similarly here. The whole purpose of this is to increase the volume of the thoracic cavity and the lungs, and therefore decrease pressure. After listening to this, I once again made a mistake. I realized that I said pectoralis major as being one of the accessory muscles for inhalation. It is not. It is pectoralis minor. Now let's look at what happens during exhalation. First of all, going back to the muscles of inhalation, just taking a look here, the external intercostals and the diaphragm during exhalations are just simply going to relax. Okay, this is passive. During quiet breathing, there is no contraction of muscles. By relaxing these, the diaphragm will go back up, the ribs will go back down, and the overall goal now, of course, is to decrease volume, therefore increasing pressure so that the air will move from the lungs into the atmosphere. Now let's take a look at what's happening during forced exhalation or labored exhalation. Okay, this is not passive, and there are quite a few different muscles involved here. First of all, the internal intercostals are going to contract, pulling the ribs down. Okay, and then we have the abdominal muscles, and these include the external oblique, the internal oblique, transverse abdominis, and rectus abdominis. Okay, again, the overall goal here is to decrease the volume and increase the pressure. So forced exhalation, unlike quiet exhalation, is not passive. First, let's talk about the control of quiet breathing. The control center for controlling the rhythm of breathing is in the medulla. It's called the medullary rhythmicity area, and it consists of two areas or two groups of neurons. There is the dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group. I just want to note that in the past these two groups had different names, of course. So the dorsal respiratory group used to be called the inspiratory area. And even if you were to look at another edition of this current textbook, you would see that these names have changed. So I just don't want any confusion here. I will from now on be using the DRG and VRG, but just making sure that you understand that the DRG used to be called the inspiratory and the VRG used to be called the expiratory. Looking at quiet breathing now, the dorsal respiratory group is going to be active for about 2 seconds and inactive for about 3 seconds. Now let's just compare this activity to what is going on in the respiratory muscles. When the dorsal respiratory group is active, it is actively sending signals to the diaphragm and the external intercostals to contract. So when it is active, we are going to have inhalation. During the inactivity, the muscles will relax and we will have exhalation. So you can now see the pattern of breathing. We're going to have inhalation for about 2 seconds and exhalation for about 3 seconds. This is during normal quiet breathing. What is controlling this pattern of activity in the dorsal respiratory group is actually the ventral respiratory group, and specifically there are a group of cells called pacemaker cells which are going to be sending impulses to the dorsal respiratory group and controlling its activity and inactivity. During forced inhalation, the dorsal respiratory group will be sending out signals to the diaphragm and the external intercostals and will be active, and that's the same as what would be occurring during normal quiet breathing. But in addition to this, they also send out signals to the ventral respiratory group, and in particular to forced inhalation neurons, which are then going to be sending out signals to the accessory muscles. Now, remembering that for forced inhalation, this includes the sternocleidomastoid, the scalenes, and the pectoralis minor. Looking at forced exhalation, let's just go back for a second and talk about quiet or normal exhalation. Remembering that the dorsal respiratory group during that time was inactive, so it was not sending out any signals. So during forced exhalation, what's going to happen is the ventral respiratory group is going to trigger the forced exhalation neurons. These neurons are then going to trigger muscle contraction in the accessory muscles, remembering that those accessory muscles include the internal intercostals, the external and internal obliques, and the transverse and rectus abdominis. I just want to end by talking about one more group of neurons found in the pons, and this is called the pontine respiratory group. It used to be called something else. It used to be called the pneumotaxic area. So again, don't be confused if you're looking at a previous edition of this textbook or other resources and you see the pneumotaxic area. It is now called the pontine respiratory group. And what this does is it sends impulses to the DRG, and the DRG, of course, then can send information and control the VRG. And this is important in modifying the basic rhythm of breathing. Certainly during exercising, sleeping, or speaking, this pontine respiratory group will modify that basic activity that has been established by the DRG and the VRG.